Sometimes the loneliest among us carry the deepest secrets. At 73, Jedediah Crowley had made peace with spending his final years alone in the Montana wilderness. His only companion, a faithful old dog named Buck. Every morning, Buck would disappear into the forest and return by noon. But one day, Buck came back with something strange, wet dollar bills in his mouth. The next day, more money, then more. Where was an old dog finding cash in the mountains? When Jed finally followed Buck's trail down a misty ravine, he discovered a buried stagecoach from a 50-year-old robbery. Inside was something that changed everything, a letter addressed to him from a brother he'd mourned as dead. The money was just the beginning. What secret from Jed's past connected him to this forgotten crime? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Bitterroot Range, like memories to an old man's heart. Jedediah Crowley stood on the weathered porch of his cabin, cradling a steaming cup of black coffee in hands that had seen 73 winters. The silence up here was different from the silence he'd known in other places, not empty, but full of wind through pine needles, the distant call of a hawk, and the steady breathing of mountains that had stood watch long before his grandfather's grandfather was born. Buck lifted his grizzled head from the porch boards, ears twitching at some sound only he could hear. The old blue-tick hound had been Jed's shadow for 8 years now, ever since he'd found the half-starved pup wandering near the trading post down in Hamilton. They'd grown old together, these two bachelors, settling into routines as predictable as the seasons themselves. "Morning, old friend," Jed murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Buck's ears. The dog's tail gave a lazy thump against the worn planks. In a few minutes, Buck would stretch, yawn, and pad down the trail for his daily exploration of their domain. He'd return by noon, tongue lolling, sometimes with a rabbit or grouse, more often with nothing but pine needles stuck to his coat, and that satisfied look dogs get when they've been properly about their business. The cabin itself was modest but solid. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that faced east toward the sunrise. Jed had built it himself 15 years ago, when the noise of the world had become too much and the mountains had called him home. Every log had been chosen, cut, and fitted by his own hands. The chinking between the logs bore the marks of countless repairs, and the roof showed patches where he'd replaced shingles after particularly harsh storms. Inside, the main room held the essentials: a sturdy table, 2 chairs, though only one ever saw use, shelves lined with practical books on weather patterns, animal tracking, and plant identification. A worn leather journal sat open on the table, its pages filled with Jed's careful observations about temperature changes, wildlife movements, and the subtle signs that told him when storms were coming. He'd been keeping such records since his arrival, partly from habit, partly to give his mind something to do during the long winter evenings. The journal was more than weather notes, though he'd never admitted it to himself. Scattered between entries about barometric pressure and animal tracks were fragments of memory. A line about Sarah's laugh echoing off canyon walls. A note about how Thomas used to whistle while he worked. Observations about the particular shade of gold the aspen leaves turned the autumn before his wife passed. These weren't the deliberate reminiscences of a man dwelling on the past, but the inevitable seepage of a heart that had loved deeply and lost much. Jed had come to the mountains not to hide, exactly, but to find a place where the pace of life matched the rhythm of his aging body and wounded spirit. Down in the valleys, everything moved too fast, demanded too much. People wanted answers to questions he didn't know how to ask, solutions to problems that seemed to multiply faster than rabbits in spring. Up here, the problems were simpler: stay warm, stay fed, stay alert to the weather's moods. His military service had taught him self-reliance and attention to detail, skills that served him well in the wilderness. 22 years in the army, including 2 tours in Vietnam that he rarely discussed even with himself. He'd been good at his job, too good perhaps. The ability to read terrain, anticipate trouble, and remain calm under pressure had made him valuable to his commanders and dangerous to his enemies. But it had also carved something out of him, left spaces that civilian life never quite managed to fill. After the service, he'd tried to settle into normal life with Sarah in Missoula. For a while it had worked. She'd been patient with his silences, understanding of his need to check locks twice and sit with his back to the wall in restaurants. Their small house had been filled with her garden, her laughter, her endless capacity for making ordinary moments feel like celebrations. For 12 years, she'd been his anchor to the gentle world. When the cancer took her, Jed had tried to carry on. He'd kept the garden going for a season, maintained the house, went through the motions of a life that no longer felt like his own. But everywhere he looked, he saw her absence more clearly than he'd ever seen her presence. The empty coffee cup beside his in the morning, the silent phone that used to ring with calls from her sister, the garden that bloomed beautifully that final summer, as if Sarah were still tending it from somewhere beyond his reach. The move to the mountains hadn't been a retreat, he told himself, but a return. His family had been Montana people going back 4 generations. His great-grandfather had come west with the railroad crews, stayed for the timber work, and eventually claimed a homestead in the valley below, where Jed now lived. The Crowley name was carved on headstones in 3 different cemeteries between Hamilton and Missoula, marking the resting places of people who'd understood that sometimes a man needed space to breathe. Thomas had understood that. His younger brother had been the dreamer in the family, always talking about heading further west, maybe to California or Oregon. "There's gold in them hills, Jed," he'd say, grinning that crooked grin that made everyone forgive him his wild schemes. Thomas had been 26 when the stagecoach he'd been riding disappeared into legend, another victim of the outlaw troubles that plagued Montana in the 1870s. Jed had been 28 then, already married to Sarah, already talking about starting a family. The official report had been brief: stagecoach attacked by unknown assailants, 3 passengers and the driver killed. Strongbox stolen, bodies never recovered. Thomas Crowley was listed among the presumed dead, his name carved on the family headstone next to their parents. For 50 years, Jed had carried that grief, along with the guilt that came from being the older brother who should have protected the younger one. Buck's routine kept Jed anchored to the present most days. The dog's needs were simple and immediate: food, water, companionship, and the freedom to explore the territory that had become their shared kingdom. In the evening, Buck would settle beside Jed's chair while the old man read or wrote in his journal. Sometimes Jed would talk to the dog, sharing thoughts he'd never voiced to another human being. Buck listened without judgment, his presence a comfort that asked for nothing more complicated than a scratch behind the ears and a warm place to sleep. The trading post visits were Jed's only regular contact with the outside world. Once a month he'd load his pack with furs and carved items he'd made, hike the 12 miles down to Pete's place, and trade for supplies. Pete McAllister had been running the post for 30 years, serving the scattered community of trappers, hunters, and hermits who preferred the mountains to town life. He was a good man who understood the value of silence and the courtesy of not asking too many questions. "You're looking well, Jed," Pete would say, as if Jed had been gone for years instead of weeks. They'd conduct their business with few words, Pete accepting whatever Jed had brought to trade and providing coffee, ammunition, and the occasional newspaper that was only a few weeks old. Sometimes Pete would share news from town: who had died, who had married, which businesses were thriving or failing. But he never pressed for Jed's opinions or reactions. The mountains themselves were Jed's true companions. He knew their moods as intimately as he'd once known Sarah's expressions. He could read the weather in the way clouds gathered around the peaks, predict the severity of coming storms by the behavior of the wildlife. The elk migration patterns told him when winter would arrive early or late. The wildflower blooms marked the passage of seasons more accurately than any calendar. In summer, he tended a small garden behind the cabin, growing potatoes, onions. and beans that would keep him fed through the cold months. He supplemented his diet with game when Buck's hunting expeditions were successful, and with fish from the streams that rushed down from the high country. His needs were simple, his wants even simpler. A good fire on cold nights, a dry roof when the storms came, and the steady presence of an old dog who asked no questions about the past. Buck had his own relationship with the wilderness, one that Jed respected but didn't fully understand. The dog would disappear into the forest each morning as if following a map written in scents invisible to human senses. He'd return with burrs in his coat, mud on his paws, and that satisfied expression that suggested he'd been attending to important business. Occasionally he'd bring back a stick or stone that had caught his fancy, dropping it at Jed's feet like an offering before settling down for an afternoon nap. The rhythm of their days had become as natural as breathing. Dawn brought coffee and the morning ritual of checking the weather, reading the night sounds for signs of predators or storms. Midday meant Buck's return and a shared meal on the porch if the weather allowed. Afternoon was for maintenance work, splitting wood, repairing equipment, tending the garden. Evening brought the quiet hours when Jed would write in his journal while Buck dozed by the fire. It was a life that suited an old soldier who'd seen enough of the world's complications. The mountains didn't lie or betray or demand more than a man could give. They simply stood, enduring, offering shelter to those who understood their ways and respected their power. For 15 years, this had been enough. But old habits die hard, and Jed had noticed changes in Buck's routine over the past few weeks. The dog had been leaving earlier and staying out longer, returning with a restlessness that seemed almost human in its intensity. His coat had been wetter than usual, as if he'd been exploring areas near water, and there had been something in his expression, a kind of urgency that reminded Jed of soldiers who'd seen something they couldn't quite process. Standing on his porch that morning, watching Buck pad down the familiar trail, Jed felt the stirring of an old instinct he thought he'd left behind. The same feeling that had kept him alive in hostile territory, the sense that patterns were changing, and change meant potential danger. Buck disappeared into the tree line, and for the first time in years, Jed wondered where exactly his old friend spent those morning hours. The question would haunt him for the rest of the day, growing stronger with each hour that passed before Buck's return. And when the dog finally did come home, carrying something that would shatter the peaceful rhythm of their mountain life forever, Jed would understand that some changes, once begun, could not be undone. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Jed stood on his porch, coffee steam curling up into the crisp mountain air, watching Buck pad down the familiar trail toward the tree line. But something felt different. The dog's gait carried an urgency that had been building for days, and when he paused at the forest's edge to look back, his eyes held an almost human intelligence that made the hair on Jed's arms stand up. "What's got into you, old boy?" Jed muttered. But Buck had already disappeared into the shadows between the pines. The morning dragged on with unusual weight. Jed tried to lose himself in routine, splitting kindling, checking his snares, reviewing the weather signs that suggested an early storm moving in from the west. But his attention kept drifting to the forest where Buck had vanished. The dog's behavior over the past 3 weeks had been increasingly strange, and today something told Jed he was about to understand why. When Buck emerged from the tree line just after 11, Jed was waiting. The dog trotted up the path with his tail wagging, but there was something clenched between his jaws, something that made Jed's coffee cup slip from suddenly nerveless fingers. Dollar bills. Wet, muddy dollar bills. What in the Sam Hill? Jed knelt as Buck dropped the soggy currency at his feet. 3 $20 bills, old but not ancient, waterlogged and stained with forest mud. Buck sat back on his haunches, tongue lolling, looking as pleased as if he'd brought home a prize rabbit. Jed picked up the bills with shaking hands. The paper was soft from moisture, but the printing was clear enough. These weren't some old-timers' buried treasure or lost hiking money. They were real currency, and Buck had been carrying them gently enough in his mouth that they remained largely intact. "Where did you get these, boy?" Jed's voice came out rougher than he intended. Buck cocked his head, then stood and walked a few steps toward the forest before looking back expectantly. The message was clear as words. Come and see. For 15 years, Jed had been content to let Buck roam freely, trusting the dog's instincts and wilderness wisdom. But now, looking at the wet money in his palm, he felt the stirring of something he'd thought buried deeper than his wife's grave. Curiosity, yes, but more than that. The old soldier's need to understand potential threats, to investigate anomalies that might mean danger. The next morning, Jed was ready. He'd spent the previous evening checking his gear, a habit from his army days that had never truly left him. His pack held water, jerky, a first aid kit, and his service pistol cleaned and loaded. Buck seemed to sense the change in routine and dance with excitement as Jed laced up his hiking boots. "All right, old friend. Show me what's got you so worked up." Buck needed no second invitation. He bounded down the trail with more energy than Jed had seen from him in months, pausing only to ensure his human companion was keeping up. Instead of taking the familiar paths Jed knew led to the best hunting grounds, Buck veered off onto a game trail that wound down into a ravine Jed had never bothered to explore. The descent was steep, made treacherous by loose rocks and fallen logs. Mist hung thick between the trees, giving the forest an otherworldly quality that reminded Jed uncomfortably of certain valleys in Vietnam. His boots found purchase on wet stone and root-slick earth as he followed Buck's sure-footed path deeper, into terrain that seemed to exist outside of normal time. The sound of water grew louder as they descended, not the cheerful babble of a mountain stream, but the deeper gurgle of water moving through obstacles. Buck led them along what must once have been a creek bed, now choked with fallen timber and decades of accumulated debris. The air smelled of decomposition and secrets, that particular scent of places where nature had been left to reclaim what civilization had abandoned. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, Buck stopped. His ears pricked forward, his body tense with the same alertness Jed recognized from their hunting expeditions. But this wasn't prey behavior. This was something else entirely. Jed pushed through a screen of low-hanging branches and stopped dead. There, half buried beneath layers of pine needles, fallen logs, and 47 years of forest growth, was a stagecoach. The sight hit him like a physical blow. He'd grown up on stories of the old Montana stagecoach routes, the legendary robberies that had plagued travelers in the 1870s and 1880s. But seeing one of these relics in person, hidden away in a forgotten ravine like some massive secret, was something else entirely. The coach was a Wells Fargo model, its once bright paint faded to ghost traces of yellow and red. The wooden sides bore the unmistakable marks of violence, bullet holes that had weathered into dark, accusing eyes. One wheel was completely gone, the axle buried deep in mud and moss. The other wheels sat at odd angles, giving the whole contraption the appearance of some great beast that had crawled into this hidden place to die. Buck circled the wreck with professional interest, his nose working the scents that clung to weathered wood and rusted metal. Jed approached more cautiously, his soldier's instincts cataloguing details automatically. The positioning of the coach, the scatter pattern of debris, the way certain parts had been stripped away while others remained intact. All of it told a story of violence and hasty flight. The door hung open on broken hinges, revealing an interior that had become home to generations of small forest creatures. Leather seats, once fine enough for paying passengers, had been reduced to rotted scraps and mouse nests. But it was what lay scattered around the coach that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. Bones, human bones, bleached white by decades of weather and picked clean by scavengers. A skull grinned up at him from a bed of moss, and scattered among the fallen leaves were the remnants of what had once been the coach's passengers. Jed counted at least 3 distinct skeletons, their remains mixed with the detritus of years and the rust-stained metal of personal belongings. This wasn't just any stagecoach robbery. The positioning, the remote location, the complete disappearance of the wreck. Jed's memory supplied the details his conscious mind had been avoiding. The Copper Creek robbery of 1873. 3 passengers and a driver, presumed killed. The strongbox never recovered. And among the missing passengers, Thomas Crowley, aged 26, described in the newspaper reports as a young man of good character seeking his fortune in the Western Territories. Jed's knees went weak. He gripped the side of the coach for support, his mind reeling with the implications. For nearly 50 years, this wreck had been lying here, Thomas's bones somewhere among the scattered remains. The family had buried an empty coffin, carved his name on a headstone that marked nothing but hope and grief. Buck whined softly and nuzzled against Jed's leg. The dog had been coming here for weeks, Jed realized. Somehow Buck had found this place and understood its importance before the human did. The wet dollar bills weren't just random trash, they were breadcrumbs, leading Jed to this moment of terrible discovery. With trembling hands, Jed began to search the wreckage more systematically. The strongbox was there, half buried beneath the driver's seat, its iron construction intact despite the years. The lock had been broken long ago, and the interior showed signs of water damage, but there were still bills inside. Hundreds of them, slowly dissolving back into the earth that had hidden them for so long. But it wasn't the money that stopped his heart. It was the small metal box, no bigger than a tobacco tin, wedged beneath what had once been a passenger seat. The metal was rusted but intact, and when Jed pried it open with shaking fingers, he found the contents had been protected by an oiled cloth wrapper, papers, letters, and on top, in handwriting he would have recognized in the dark, an envelope addressed in Thomas's careful script for Jedediah Crowley, Bitterroot Range, Montana Territory. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Jed stared at his own name written in his dead brother's hand. Buck sat quietly beside him, as if understanding that this moment required reverence. Somewhere in the distance a hawk called, but the sound seemed to come from another world entirely. 50 years of grief, 50 years of guilt, 50 years of carrying the weight of a brother he couldn't protect. And here was Thomas reaching across the decades with a message that would change everything Jed thought he knew about the past. His hands shook as he opened the envelope. Whatever Thomas had written, whatever secret had died with him in this forgotten ravine, was about to return from the dead. The letter felt impossibly light in Jed's weathered hands, as if it might crumble at his touch. Buck remained motionless beside the wreckage, his instincts telling him that whatever was about to unfold required absolute stillness. The forest around them seemed to lean in, centuries-old pines bearing witness to a moment that would bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Jed's fingers traced the familiar slope of Thomas's handwriting, the same careful script that had once addressed birthday, letters and postcards from distant towns. The envelope bore a date, September 15, 1875, 2 years after the robbery. 2 years after the family had buried an empty coffin and carved Thomas's name in granite. With the reverence of a man handling sacred text, Jed opened the envelope. The paper inside was yellowed but intact, protected by the oiled cloth and metal tin from the moisture that had claimed so much else. As he unfolded the letter, Thomas's voice seemed to whisper from the grave, "My dear brother Jedediah, if you are reading this, then God has finally answered my prayers and brought someone to this cursed place who might understand what truly happened here. I pray it is you. Though I fear the years may have changed us both beyond recognition, I am alive, Jed, or was, when I wrote these words in the autumn of 1875. The newspapers spoke truly when they said the passengers of the Copper Creek stage died that terrible day in May of 73. But they were wrong about how we died, and they were wrong about who killed us. We were not set upon by common road agents or drifters looking for easy money. The men who attacked our coach wore badges beneath their coats, and their leader called the shots with the authority of law. Sheriff Banks himself rode with them, Jed. William Banks, who claimed to be investigating our disappearance while he was counting the money they stole from our corpses. Jed's hands began to shake. Sheriff Banks had been a fixture in Hamilton for years, a man whose word was law and whose reputation was above reproach. The idea that he could have orchestrated the very crimes he claimed to investigate was almost too monstrous to comprehend. I survived only by the grace of God and a fierce blow to my skull that left me for dead beneath poor Miller's body. When I came to consciousness hours later, the sun was setting and the wolves were already beginning to circle. I crawled away into the brush, bleeding and broken, but alive. For days I wandered in the wilderness, fever-mad and half-dead from my wounds. An old prospector named Henrik found me, nursed me back to health in his cabin up near the divide. But when I told him what I had seen, what I knew about Banks and his corruption, Henrik grew afraid. "They'll kill you sure if you go back," he said. "And they'll kill me too for helping you." So I became a dead man, Jed. Thomas Crowley died in that ravine with the others, and I took a new name, a new life. Henrik helped me get to Oregon, where I found work under the name David Miller, taking the surname of the poor soul whose body had shielded me from the final bullets. The letter went on to describe Thomas's new life in the lumber camps of Oregon. Always looking over his shoulder, always afraid that somehow Banks would discover he had survived. He had married, Thomas wrote, and had children who would never know their real grandfather's name. But he had never stopped gathering evidence, never stopped planning for the day when he might return to Montana and expose the truth. I have collected sworn statements from men who worked with Banks in those days, men who grew tired of his corruption and fled west as I did. I've documented his methods, his associates, the other robberies and murders that were laid at the feet of phantom outlaws, while the real killers wore the star of justice. But I am not a young man anymore. Jed, the years have worn on me, and I fear I may not live to see justice done. If something happens to me before I can return to Montana, I want you to know the truth. More than that, I want you to have the evidence I've gathered. It's hidden where only a Crowley would think to look, in the old lightning-struck pine above Copper Falls, the one where we used to cache our fishing tackle when we were boys. Look for the hollow on the north side, 3 feet up from the base. The men who did this are still alive, Jed. Banks is an old man now, but I've heard he still holds power in Hamilton. There are others too, his deputies who helped him that day, the corrupt officials who helped cover up the truth. They've grown rich on blood money while our parents went to their graves believing their youngest son died at the hands of common thieves. I know I have no right to ask this of you after all these years of letting you believe me dead. But if you find this letter, if Buck or some other miracle leads you to this place, please consider whether justice might still be possible. Not just for me, but for all the innocent men who died along these roads while the real killers hid behind badges and respectability. The letter was signed simply, "Your brother, Thomas David Crowley Miller." Below the signature was a postscript that hit Jed like a physical blow. I named my eldest son Jedediah, after the brother who taught me to track and hunt and survive. He's a good boy, and he asks about his Uncle Jed sometimes. I tell him you're a mountain man now, living free in the high country where the air is clean and a man can think clearly. I hope I haven't lied to him. Jed stared at the final lines until the words blurred. Somewhere in Oregon, he had a nephew named after him. Somewhere in the world, Thomas's bloodline continued, carrying forward the Crowley name in a different form. The thought was almost too overwhelming to process. Buck whined softly and pressed against Jed's leg, sensing his distress. The old dog had been remarkably patient during the long minutes of reading. But now he seemed to understand that his human needed comfort more than solitude. He lived. "Buck," Jed whispered, his voice cracking. "My brother lived for years after we buried him. Had a family. Had children." The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them aloud might make the miraculous truth feel real. But even as joy flooded through him at the knowledge of Thomas's survival, a darker emotion began to take root. Anger, rage at the men who had murdered innocent travelers and let their crimes be blamed on phantom outlaws. Fury at Sheriff Banks, who had built his reputation on lies and corruption while families like the Crowleys mourned their dead. And guilt Oh, the guilt was perhaps worst of all. While Jed had been living his quiet mountain life, content in his solitude and his carefully maintained routines, Thomas had been alone in Oregon, carrying the burden of terrible knowledge. He died a stranger in a strange land, his children never knowing their father's real name or their Montana heritage. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as Jed carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in its protective tin. Buck watched him with patient eyes, as if understanding that everything had changed in the space of those few pages. The peaceful rhythm of their mountain life, the carefully maintained distance from the world's complications, all of it had been shattered by words written nearly 50 years ago. Standing slowly, Jed looked around the wreckage with new eyes. This wasn't just a historical curiosity or a tragic accident. This was a crime scene, and somewhere among these scattered bones lay what remained of his brother. The thought should have brought comfort, at least now he knew where Thomas was buried. But instead, it brought only a burning need for justice that he thought had died with his youth. "Come on. And boy," he said quietly to Buck, "we've got work to do." The hike back to the cabin passed in a blur of memories and raw emotion. Buck stayed close to Jed's side, as if sensing that his human needed the comfort of companionship more than the freedom to process alone. The letter felt like a burning coal in Jed's jacket pocket, its weight far greater than the few ounces of paper and ink it actually contained. By the time they reached the familiar clearing where his cabin stood, dusk was settling over the mountains like a heavy blanket. Jed's hands shook as he lit the kerosene lamp, the warm glow doing little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. Buck curled up by the fireplace while Jed sat at his rough-hewn table. The letter spread before him like evidence in a court case. He read it again, slowly this time, absorbing details he'd missed in his initial shock. The date, September 1875. Thomas had lived at least 2 years after the robbery, long enough to heal from his wounds, find work, and begin gathering evidence. The careful handwriting spoke of a man who'd had time to think, to plan, to hope that someday justice might be possible. The memories came flooding back then, as if Thomas's words had broken open a dam Jed had spent decades building. He saw his brother as he'd been at 26, tall and lean, with their father's stubborn jaw and their mother's laughing eyes. Thomas had always been the dreamer, the one who saw possibilities where others saw only problems. While Jed had been content to work the family farm and court the prettiest girl in Hamilton, Thomas had talked endlessly about the opportunities waiting in the Western Territories. "There's fortunes to be made out there." "Jed," Thomas had said the morning he left for what would be his final journey. "Gold, silver, timber. A man with ambition and willing hands can make something of himself." He'd been carrying everything he owned in a single carpet bag, his life savings sewn into the lining of his coat. The plan had been simple: take the stagecoach to Butte, assess the mining opportunities, and send for Jed if the prospects looked good. Instead, he'd ridden straight into an ambush orchestrated by the very men sworn to protect travelers on the dangerous mountain roads. Jed rose from the table and walked to the old trunk where he kept his few treasures. Beneath spare blankets and his service medals wrapped in oiled cloth was a small wooden box that hadn't been opened in years. Inside, yellowed with age, was a daguerreotype photograph taken in Hamilton's only portrait studio sometime in the late 1860s. The photograph showed the Crowley family in their Sunday best, their father stern and proud in his one good suit, their mother's hand resting gently on his shoulder, and between them, 2 young men who shared the same strong features and determined expressions. Jed traced Thomas's face with a trembling finger, marveling at how young they'd both looked, how certain of their futures. The photograph had been Thomas's idea. "For posterity," he'd said with that grin that could charm birds from trees. "So our grandchildren will know what handsome devils their grandfathers were." They'd all laughed at his presumption, but they'd dressed up and posed for the photographer anyway, creating what Jed now realized might be the only image of Thomas that survived. But Thomas had survived too, at least for a while. Somewhere in Oregon, he'd built a new life under a borrowed name, married a woman whose face Jed would never see, raised children who carried Crowley blood but not the Crowley name. The nephew named Jedediah would be a grown man now, possibly with children of his own. An entire branch of the family tree that Jed had never known existed, scattered across the Western Territories like seeds on the wind. The guilt was almost unbearable. While Thomas had been struggling to build a new identity in a strange land, always looking over his shoulder for killers who might discover his survival, Jed had been living in ignorance. He'd mourned at an empty grave, carried guilt over a brother he couldn't protect, never knowing that Thomas was alive and fighting his own battles hundreds of miles away. Buck stirred by the fire, lifting his head to study Jed with those patient brown eyes. The dog had known somehow. All those morning expeditions, all those trips to the ravine where the stagecoach lay buried, Buck had been trying to tell him something, trying to lead him to the truth. Animals had their own ways of understanding the world, their own connections to mysteries that humans couldn't fathom. You knew, didn't you, boy? Jed said softly. You knew something was down there that I needed to find. Buck's tail thumped once against the floor, a gentle acknowledgement that seemed to say, I brought you what you needed to know. Now what are you going to do about it? What indeed? The letter had given Jed information that could shake the foundations of Hamilton's law enforcement, but it had also presented him with an impossible choice. Sheriff Banks would be in his 80s now if he was still alive at all. The corruption Thomas had described had happened nearly 50 years ago. Most of the perpetrators were likely dead, and those who remained were probably too old and frail to face justice in any meaningful way. But justice wasn't always about punishment, Jed realized. Sometimes it was simply about truth, about ensuring that victims were remembered correctly and that their stories were told. Thomas and the other passengers on that stagecoach had been dismissed as unlucky travelers who'd met with common road agents. Their deaths had been used to justify increased law enforcement powers, increased budgets, increased authority for the very men who'd killed them. The evidence Thomas mentioned in his letter, the documents hidden in the lightning-struck pine above Copper Falls, might still be there. Jed knew the tree Thomas was referring to, a massive ponderosa that had been split by lightning when they were boys. They'd used its hollow trunk as a cache for fishing gear and childhood treasures, a secret place where two brothers had stored the small mysteries of their growing years. If Thomas had managed to hide his evidence there before his death, it might still be waiting. After all these decades, the truth might be within reach, preserved in another oiled cloth bundle, like the letter that had started this journey into the past. The rational part of Jed's mind whispered caution. He was 73 years old, living a quiet life that asked nothing of him but survival and self-reliance. Opening old wounds, pursuing ancient grievances, such things were for younger men with more energy and less to lose. The smart thing would be to rebury Thomas's letter, let the dead rest in peace, and return to the simple rhythms that had sustained him for 15 years. But as he looked at the daguerreotype, at Thomas's young face full of hope and ambition, Jed felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Purpose. The sense that there was still important work to be done, still debts to be paid, and promises to be kept. Thomas had spent his final years gathering evidence, preparing for a justice that never came. The least his older brother could do was finish what Thomas had started. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending clouds racing across the face of the moon. Buck raised his head and whined softly, his ears tuned to sounds that human senses couldn't detect. Change was coming to their mountain sanctuary, whether they were ready for it or not. The journey to Pete's trading post took on new significance the next morning. Where once it had been a routine supply run, now it felt like a reconnaissance mission. Jed packed his usual trade goods, carved wooden items and cured pelts, but his real purpose was research. If Thomas's accusations about Sheriff Banks were true, there would be traces of that corruption in the historical record. Fragments of truth buried beneath decades of accepted narrative. Pete McAllister looked up from his ledger as Jed entered the post. his weathered face creasing into its customary greeting smile. The trading post served as more than a supply depot for the scattered mountain folk. It was also the unofficial archive of local history, its shelves lined with old newspapers, territorial documents, and the accumulated memories of men who'd witnessed Montana's transformation from wilderness to statehood. Morning. Jed, you're looking a mite peaked today. Everything all right up your way? Fine, Pete, just fine. Jed set his pack on the counter, but his eyes were already scanning the shelves where Pete kept back issues of the Hamilton Herald and other regional newspapers. I was wondering if you might still have some of those old papers from the 70s. Got myself curious about the early days, the Indian troubles and such. Pete's eyebrows rose slightly. In all the years he'd known Jed, the mountain man had never shown the slightest interest in local history or idle research. But Pete was a businessman who understood the value of customer satisfaction, and he was also a friend who recognized when a man needed space to work through his own thoughts. Sure thing. Got boxes of them in the back room. Papers from Helena, Butte, Missoula, even some from back when Hamilton was just a trading post like this one. You looking for anything particular? Maybe around 1873, 74, the stagecoach troubles, you know. Road agents and such? Pete nodded knowingly. The Copper Creek robbery. That was a bad business. Lost some good folks on that run. He paused, studying Jed's face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read customers' needs. My pa used to tell stories about those days. Said it was Sheriff Banks who finally put an end to the outlaw troubles, though it cost him plenty. Lost some good deputies in the process. Jed's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. Banks was sheriff back then? Oh, yes. William Banks, finest lawman the territory ever had, according to most folks. Served for near 20 years before he retired. Must have been in his 40s when the Copper Creek thing happened. Already making quite a name for himself. Pete disappeared into the back room and returned with several dusty boxes. Of course, some folks whispered that Banks was maybe too successful, if you know what I mean. Seemed like he always knew where the outlaws would strike next, always managed to arrive just after they'd finished their business. The casual comment hit Jed like a thunderbolt. Here was independent confirmation of Thomas's claims. Not proof, exactly, but the kind of local gossip that often contained more truth than official records. Folks whispered, you say? Pete shrugged, already moving to organize Jed's trade goods. You know how it is in small towns. Success breeds suspicion, especially when that success comes at convenient times. But Banks was never officially questioned about anything, and he did eventually clean up the territory. Retired to a nice spread east of town, lived comfortable until, must have been 15 years ago now when he passed. Jed's heart sank. If Banks was dead, then the primary target of any justice-seeking was beyond earthly reach. But Pete continued talking, apparently warming to the subject. Course his son William Jr. took over the old man's interests. Successful businessman, that one. Owns half the timber rights between here and Missoula, plus mining interests up north. They say he's the richest man in 3 counties, though he keeps to himself mostly. Built himself a fancy house on the old family property. Lives there with his wife and grown children. Hope flickered again in Jed's chest. If the son had inherited his father's wealth, and if that wealth had been built on blood money, then perhaps some form of justice was still possible. The next several hours passed in careful research. Pete left Jed alone with the newspaper boxes, understanding that whatever drove his customers' sudden interest in history was personal and private. Jed spread out papers on Pete's back table, reading by lamplight as the afternoon wore on. The official story of the Copper Creek robbery was exactly as he remembered from contemporary accounts. On May 15, 1873, the westbound stage from Hamilton to Butte had been attacked by unknown assailants. 3 passengers, including Thomas Crowley and the driver, had been killed. The strong box containing mining payroll and passenger valuables had been stolen. Sheriff Banks had led the investigation, following the outlaws' trail for days before losing it in the high country. But as Jed read more carefully, inconsistencies began to emerge. The investigation had been remarkably brief for such a significant crime. No witnesses had been found, despite the attack occurring on a well-traveled road during daylight hours. The outlaws had left remarkably little physical evidence, almost as if they'd known exactly how to avoid detection. More troubling were the follow-up stories. In the months following the Copper Creek robbery, Sheriff Banks had achieved an unprecedented string of successes against outlaw bands. His deputies had tracked down and killed or captured dozens of suspected road agents, often in dramatic gunfights that left no survivors to tell their side of the story. The territory's crime problem had been solved with remarkable efficiency, but the dates bothered. Several of the outlaws killed by Banks's men had been wanted for crimes that occurred after the Copper Creek robbery. If they'd been responsible for killing Thomas, why had they continued their criminal activities for months afterward? And why had none of them been carrying any of the stolen money when they were finally brought to justice? As the afternoon light began to fade, Jed found what he was looking for buried in a back page of the Helena Independent, dated September 1874. It was a small item, easily overlooked. Local merchant Henrik Olsen, recently returned from Oregon Territory, reports seeing a man resembling Thomas Crowley, presumed victim of the Copper Creek robbery, working in the lumber camps near Portland. Olsen, who knew the Crowley family from his previous business dealings in Hamilton, insists the resemblance was unmistakable despite the man's use of a different name. Sheriff Banks has dismissed the report as a case of mistaken identity, noting that Mr. Olsen's eyesight has been poor since his accident at the mill. Jed's hands trembled as he read the brief notice. Here was contemporary evidence that Thomas had been spotted alive and that Sheriff Banks had actively suppressed the information. Hendrik, the prospector Thomas had mentioned in his letter, the man who'd saved his life and helped him escape to Oregon. But there was more. Carefully folded inside another newspaper from the same period was a yellowed envelope addressed to editor, Helena Independent. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the contents made Jed's blood run cold. Sir, I was deputy to Sheriff Banks during the troubles of 73 and 74. What we did was not right. The blood money weighs heavy on my conscience as I lay dying. Check the old mine shaft on Banks's property. The truth lies buried there with other things that should see daylight. A repentant lawman. The letter was unsigned and undated, but tucked inside the envelope was a small piece of metal that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. A tarnished sheriff's badge, its surface scratched and stained with what looked like old blood. Pete appeared in the doorway as Jed was examining the badge. Find what you were looking for? Jed carefully rewrapped the badge and slipped it into his pocket along with the deputy's letter. Maybe. Pete, what do you know about the old Banks property? The place where Junior lives now? Oh, that's quite a spread. Must be 2,000 acres up Beaver Creek way. Old mining claims, timber rights, the works. Junior built his house right where the original homestead stood, but he's expanded it into quite the mansion. Why do you ask? Just curious about the old families, I suppose. Jed gathered up his things, his mind already working on the implications of what he'd discovered. I should head back before full dark. As he prepared to leave, Pete caught his arm gently. Jed, I don't know what's got you stirred up about old history, but be careful. Some stones are better left unturned, especially when they might roll downhill onto powerful folks. The warning was kindly meant, but it only strengthened Jed's resolve. Thomas had spent his final years gathering evidence against corrupt lawmen who'd literally gotten away with murder. The least his brother could do was finish the job. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after Jed's visit to the trading post. He'd been splitting wood behind his cabin when Buck's ears suddenly pricked up, his body going rigid with the alertness that meant strangers on the mountain. The dog's low growl was barely audible, but it carried a warning that raised the hair on Jed's arms. Through the trees, barely visible in the afternoon shadows, Jed caught a glimpse of movement. A flash of dark clothing, the glint of sunlight off metal, possibly binoculars or a rifle scope. Someone was watching his cabin, and they were trying hard not to be seen. Jed's military instincts kicked in immediately. Without appearing to notice the watchers, he continued splitting wood while his eyes catalogued escape routes and defensive positions. The old training came back as if he'd never left the service. Assess the threat, identify advantages, prepare for multiple contingencies. That evening he conducted a careful reconnaissance of his property. The tracks he found confirmed his fears. At least 2 men, possibly 3, had been observing his cabin from concealed positions. They'd been professional about it, staying downwind and avoiding obvious vantage points, but they'd left signs that an experienced tracker could read. Boot prints in soft earth, broken twigs at head height, the subtle disturbance that came from humans trying to move silently through wilderness. Most troubling was what he found near his woodshed. Someone had been inside his cabin while he was at the trading post. Nothing was missing, but small things were out of place. His journal moved slightly on the table, his pack repositioned in a way that suggested it had been searched. The intruders had been careful, but not careful enough for a man who'd learned to notice such things in places where inattention meant death. The message came 2 days later, and its delivery method told Jed everything he needed to know about the seriousness of his situation. Buck found it first, whining anxiously at the cabin door when they returned from checking Jed's snares. Pinned to the rough wood with a hunting knife was a sheet of paper. Its message, written in block letters, designed to disguise the author's handwriting. Some secrets should stay buried. Mind your own business or join your brother in the ground. Jed read the note twice, his hands steady despite the ice in his veins. The reference to Thomas was unmistakably specific. Whoever had written this knew about the connection between Jed's investigation and his dead brother. More chilling still was the implication that Thomas's fate hadn't been accidental. Buck circled the cabin nervously, his nose working scents that spoke of strangers and potential violence. The dog's behavior confirmed what Jed already suspected. They were being watched even now, probably from multiple positions in the surrounding forest. The smart thing would be to pack up and disappear deeper into the mountains. Find some remote cabin or cave where he could wait out whatever storm his investigation had stirred up. At 73, he had no business tangling with enemies who were young enough to be his grandsons, well-funded enough to hire professional help, and ruthless enough to threaten an old hermit who'd stumbled onto their family's dark history. But the photograph of Thomas, tucked safely in his jacket pocket, seemed to burn against his chest. His brother had spent decades gathering evidence, living in fear, hoping that someday justice might be possible. To abandon that quest now would be to betray not just Thomas's memory, but all the innocent people who died while corrupt lawmen lined their pockets with blood money. That night, Jed made his preparations with the methodical thoroughness of a man who'd planned for hostile action in hostile territory. He cleaned and loaded his service pistol, then retrieved the hunting rifle he'd kept wrapped in oiled cloth since his arrival in the mountains. His pack was organized with military precision: ammunition, first-aid supplies, emergency food, and the evidence he'd gathered so far. Most importantly, he wrote his own letter, a detailed account of everything he'd discovered about Thomas's survival, Sheriff Banks's corruption, and the evidence that might still be hidden on the bank's property. He sealed the letter in a waterproof pouch and hid it in a location where it would eventually be found if something happened to him. Buck seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. The old dog stayed close to Jed's side, his senses tuned to dangers that human perception might miss. Several times during the night, Buck's low growls alerted Jed to movement in the forest around their cabin, prowlers who were testing their defenses, learning their routines, preparing for whatever action they planned to take. Morning brought a new level of threat. While checking the perimeter around his cabin, Jed discovered that someone had sabotaged his water supply. The pipe that carried spring water to his cabin had been deliberately damaged, forcing him to rely on stored water or risk exposing himself by visiting the spring directly. More ominously, his escape routes had been compromised. The main trail down to the valley showed signs of recent activity: footprints, disturbed vegetation, and the kind of deliberate obstacles that suggested someone wanted to funnel his movements in a particular direction. If he tried to flee, he'd be walking into an ambush. By noon, the psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. Every shadow might hide an enemy sniper. Every sound in the forest could signal an approaching attack. Buck whined constantly now, his stress feeding off Jed's own mounting paranoia. The dog's usual afternoon nap was replaced by nervous pacing and frequent trips to the windows. It was then that Jed found the second message, this one even more disturbing than the first. Carved into the bark of the pine tree nearest his cabin, where he couldn't possibly miss it, were words that chilled him to the bone. Last warning, leave now or die where your brother died. The carving was fresh, made within the past few hours while Jed had been inside the cabin. Someone had crept close enough to touch his home, bold enough to work in daylight, confident enough in their superiority to leave such an explicit threat. The psychological impact was exactly what they'd intended. Jed now knew that his enemies could reach him anywhere, anytime they chose. But the threat also contained information that hardened his resolve. The reference to Thomas dying where your brother died suggested that the people threatening him knew details about Thomas's actual fate, details that wouldn't be available to anyone unless they'd been involved in the original crime or had inherited knowledge from those who were. As evening approached, Jed made his decision. Running would only delay the inevitable, and hiding would abandon any chance of justice for Thomas. If his enemies wanted a confrontation, he'd give them one, but on his terms, in terrain he knew better than they did, using skills they probably didn't know he possessed. He'd spent too many years avoiding conflict, too many years letting the world's injustices pass by, while he tended his garden and minded his own business. Thomas had died trying to expose the truth about corrupt lawmen who murdered innocent people. The least his brother could do was finish that fight, regardless of the cost. Buck seemed to sense the change in his human's demeanor. The dog's nervous pacing stopped, replaced by the alert readiness that came before action. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together, an old soldier and his faithful companion, standing against enemies who thought age and isolation made them easy targets. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While Jed was fortifying his cabin and preparing for what seemed like inevitable violence, Buck made another of his mysterious discoveries. The old dog had been restless all morning, pacing between the cabin and the forest edge, with the kind of focused energy that meant he'd found something important. "What is it, boy?" Jed followed Buck into the woods, his rifle held ready and his eyes scanning for threats. But instead of leading him toward danger, Buck guided him to a spot near the old lightning-struck pine where Thomas had once hidden their fishing gear, the same tree mentioned in the letter as the hiding place for evidence. There, caught on a low branch like a deliberate message, was a manila envelope bearing recent postmarks. Someone had been here within the last few days, and they'd wanted the envelope to be found. Jed's first instinct was to suspect a trap, but Buck's behavior suggested otherwise. The dog sniffed the envelope thoroughly, then sat back with the satisfied expression he wore when he'd successfully completed a task. With trembling hands, Jed opened the envelope. Inside were photocopied documents, land deeds, property transfers, mining claims, all bearing the name Morrison Holdings LLC and dating from the past decade. But it was the cover letter, typed on expensive stationery, that made Jed's blood run cold. "Mr. Crowley, your investigation has attracted more attention than you realize. The man you seek is not dead. Sheriff William Banks staged his own death in 1909 and has been living under the name William Morrison ever since. He is now 89 years old, but still very much alive and still very dangerous. The Morrison estate encompasses most of the land around Copper Creek, including the site where you found the stagecoach. He has been buying up surrounding properties for decades, ensuring that his secret remains buried. Your recent activities have made him desperate enough to take direct action against you. This envelope contains proof of his true identity and documentation of property purchases that can only be explained by his knowledge of where evidence might be found. Use this information wisely. A friend who shared your brother's values. The letter was unsigned, but attached to it was a photograph that stopped Jed's heart. It showed an elderly man standing beside a luxury car, his face clearly visible despite the passage of nearly 8 decades. The bone structure was unmistakable, the same sharp features, the same cold eyes that Jed remembered from faded newspaper photographs of Sheriff William Banks. More damning still were the property documents. Over the past 30 years, William Morrison had systematically purchased every piece of land within a 5-mile radius of the stagecoach wreck site. Mining claims, timber rights, water access, he'd bought it all, often paying far above market value to ensure quick sales. The pattern was too specific to be coincidental. Morrison knew exactly where evidence might be found, and he'd spent a fortune making sure no one else could find it. But the most shocking revelation was in the final document, a copy of a birth certificate from 1884, showing the birth of William Banks Morrison, son of William Banks and Margaret Morrison. The corrupt sheriff hadn't just faked his death and assumed a new identity. He'd married, had children, and built a family dynasty on the foundation of murder and theft. Jed's mind reeled with the implications. The William Morrison Jr. that Pete had mentioned, the wealthy businessman who owned half the timber rights in the territory, was the grandson of the corrupt sheriff who'd orchestrated Thomas's murder. The threats against Jed weren't coming from distant enemies protecting an old secret. They were coming from a family that had built 3 generations of prosperity on blood money. The anonymous letter had provided more than just information. It had given Jed the tools he needed to understand his enemies and their motivations. Morrison Sr., the former Sheriff Banks, was old enough to be vulnerable, but still connected enough to command resources. His family's wealth and influence had grown for decades, but it was all built on a foundation that could crumble if the truth about the Copper Creek robbery ever came to light. As Jed studied the documents, Buck's behavior changed again. The dog's ears pricked up, his body tense with the alertness that meant immediate danger. Through the trees came the sound of approaching vehicles, multiple engines, moving slowly up the rough road that led toward Jed's property. Jed quickly stuffed the documents into his pack and signaled for Buck to follow him back toward the cabin. But as they emerged from the tree line, he saw that retreat was no longer an option. 3 black SUVs were parked in his clearing, and armed men in tactical gear were taking positions around his home. From the lead vehicle stepped a figure that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. The man was tall and lean, probably in his 50s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of cold confidence that came from never being challenged. This had to be William Morrison Jr., Thomas's killer's grandson, come to finish what his family had started. But it was the elderly figure being helped from the passenger seat that truly shocked Jed. Despite his age and obvious frailty, there was no mistaking the features he'd seen in the photograph. William Banks, now calling himself William Morrison Sr., had come to personally supervise the elimination of the last threat to his family's dark secret. "Mr. Crowley," the younger Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with practiced authority. "I believe we need to have a conversation. You've been asking questions about things that don't concern you, and that's caused some people considerable distress." Jed remained hidden behind his woodshed. Buck pressed against his side. His rifle was loaded and ready, but he was outnumbered by at least 6 to 1. The smart play was to listen, to learn what he could about their intentions before making any moves that couldn't be undone. "We know you found the old stagecoach," Morrison continued. "We know you've been digging through historical records, bothering Mr. McAllister with questions about events that happened before you were born. Most troubling, we know you found something at that wreck site, something that belonged to your late brother." The casual mention of Thomas sent a surge of rage through Jed's veins, but he forced himself to remain calm. Information was power, and Morrison was revealing more than he probably intended. "Here's what's going to happen." the younger man said, his tone taking on the patient quality of someone explaining things to a stubborn child. You're going to come out from wherever you're hiding, and we're going to have a civilized discussion about how to resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone involved. Your brother made some unfortunate choices 50 years ago, choices that led to tragic consequences. But there's no reason for that old business to affect the living. From his hiding place, Jed could see the elderly Morrison leaning heavily on his grandson's arm. The old man's lips were moving, but his words were too quiet to carry across the clearing. Whatever he was saying, it was making the younger Morrison's expression darker and more determined. "Mr. Crowley," Morrison called out again, "I'm going to count to 10. If you haven't shown yourself by then, my associates are going to assume you've chosen the difficult path, and they'll respond accordingly. I'd hate for this beautiful mountain property to become the site of another unfortunate accident." The threat was crystal clear, but it also revealed something important about Morrison's thinking. He still believed he could control the situation, still thought that threats and intimidation would be enough to silence an old man who'd stumbled onto family secrets. He didn't understand that Jed had already made his choice, had already committed to finishing what Thomas started, regardless of the personal cost. As Morrison began his countdown, Jed felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. For 15 years, he'd lived a life of careful neutrality, avoiding conflict and responsibility in equal measure. But some fights couldn't be avoided, and some debts could only be paid in blood. Buck sensed the change in his human's demeanor and pressed closer, ready to follow wherever Jed's next decision might lead them. The old dog had brought him to this moment with wet dollar bills and patient persistence. Now it was time to see what an old soldier and his faithful companion could do against enemies who thought age meant weakness. The time for hiding was over. 8, 9. Morrison's countdown echoed across the clearing, but Jed was no longer listening. His mind had shifted into the tactical mode that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Vietnam and countless dangerous situations since. Time seemed to slow as he assessed his situation with the cold clarity that came from accepting that violence was inevitable. 6 armed men, possibly more in the vehicles, professional bearing, tactical equipment, coordinated positions. These weren't local thugs or hired muscle. Morrison had brought serious firepower to eliminate what he perceived as a serious threat. That told Jed everything he needed to know about how much the family had to lose if their secrets came to light. But the Morrisons had made a crucial error in choosing this location for their confrontation. Jed knew every rock, tree, and game trail within 5 miles of his cabin. He'd spent 15 years learning the mountain's moods and secrets, unconsciously preparing for a battle he'd never expected to fight. 10. Morrison's voice carried a note of genuine disappointment, as if he'd hoped the old hermit would be reasonable enough to die quietly. "Very well, Mr. Crowley, you've chosen the hard way." Hand signals passed between the tactical team members, and they began to advance toward the cabin with professional precision. But Jed was already moving, Buck silent as a shadow beside him. The old soldier and his canine companion melted into the forest as if they'd never been there at all. Jed's first objective was the cache he'd prepared 3 days earlier, when the first threatening note had made clear that violence was coming. Hidden in a hollow beneath a massive fallen log, wrapped in waterproof material, was everything he needed to conduct a guerrilla campaign against superior numbers. Additional ammunition, emergency medical supplies, and most importantly, a backup copy of all the evidence he'd gathered about the Morrison family's crimes. As he retrieved the cache, Jed could hear the tactical team beginning their sweep of his cabin. Shouted commands, the crash of furniture being overturned, the sharp crack of wood splintering under heavy boots. They'd discover soon enough that their quarry wasn't hiding inside like a frightened rabbit. Buck stayed pressed against Jed's side, his training as a hunting dog serving them both well now. The old hound knew how to move silently through underbrush, how to avoid detection while tracking prey. Now he was helping his human become the hunter rather than the hunted. The terrain favored defense, and Jed intended to use every advantage the mountains could provide. The forest floor was littered with deadfalls and boulder fields that would slow pursuing troops while providing cover for a defender who knew exactly where to find concealment. More importantly, the altitude was already affecting the tactical team's efficiency. These weren't mountain-trained soldiers. They were urban professionals operating in unfamiliar environment at elevation that thinned their blood and shortened their breath. From his concealed position, 300 yards above the cabin, Jed watched through his rifle scope as the search operation unfolded below. The tactical team's movements were competent but predictable, following standard room-clearing procedures that worked well in urban environments but were less effective in wilderness terrain. Their radio chatter was professional but revealed their growing frustration at finding empty rooms where they'd expected a cornered old man. It was then that Jed spotted something that changed everything. One of the tactical team members was carrying what looked like a metal detector, while another had a small shovel strapped to his pack. They weren't just here to eliminate a troublesome witness. They were planning to excavate evidence from his property. The Morrisons had finally decided that the risk of leaving Thomas's hidden evidence in place was greater than the risk of retrieving it. The realization brought a cold smile to Jed's weathered face. Morrison Sr. might be 89 years old, but his mind was still sharp enough to understand that Jed's investigation had brought them dangerously close to secrets that had remained buried for nearly 50 years. The anonymous documents that Buck had found proved that someone else knew about the Morrison family's true history, someone with access to information that could destroy them. As if responding to Jed's thoughts, Buck suddenly tensed and looked toward a section of forest that Jed hadn't been watching. Following the dog's gaze, Jed spotted movement among the trees. A lone figure approaching from the east, moving with the careful stealth of someone who didn't want to be detected by either side of the developing conflict. Through his scope, Jed made out the features of a woman in her 60s, gray-haired and dressed in hiking gear that suggested she was comfortable in wilderness terrain. She carried no visible weapons, but something about her movements spoke of purpose and determination that reminded Jed of his own military bearing. The woman paused behind a screen of trees, studying the tactical team's positions with the same professional assessment that Jed had been conducting. When she raised a small pair of binoculars to survey the scene, Jed caught sight of something that made his heart skip a beat. A brass compass hanging from a chain around her neck, its surface catching the afternoon sunlight with a familiar gleam. Thomas's compass, the one mentioned in his letter, engraved with the words, "To my brother Jed, may you always find your way home." Somehow, impossibly, it had found its way back to the mountain where this whole nightmare had begun. The woman lowered her binoculars and began moving toward Jed's position with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Buck's tail began to wag, not the alertness that signaled danger, but the recognition that meant friend rather than foe. Somehow, the old dog understood that this stranger was an ally in their fight against the Morrison family. When she was close, enough for whispered conversation, the woman spoke with a voice that carried traces of Thomas's inflection, his particular way of shaping words that Jed remembered from childhood. "You must be Uncle Jed," she said quietly. "I'm Sarah Crowley Miller, Thomas's granddaughter. I've been waiting 50 years to meet you." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. Thomas's granddaughter, the child of the nephew who'd been named after him, grown into a woman who carried the family name and the family's burden of seeking justice. She wore the compass that Thomas had mentioned in his letter, the one that was supposed to guide Jed home. "Your grandfather," Jed began, but Sarah held up a hand to silence him. "We can talk family history later, Uncle Jed. Right now, we need to deal with the people who killed him." Her voice carried a steel that reminded Jed of Thomas's determination when he'd set his mind to something. "I've been tracking the Morrison family for 20 years, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to expose what they've done. When I learned that someone had finally found the stagecoach wreck, I knew that moment had come. She reached into her pack and pulled out a weatherproof document case. Grandfather spent his final years collecting evidence against Sheriff Banks and his associates. Before he died, he gave everything to my father with instructions to continue the investigation. Our family has been building a case against the Morrisons for 3 generations, waiting for someone to discover the physical evidence that would make prosecution possible. The case contained photographs, documents, witness statements, and genealogical records that traced the Morrison family's wealth back to its corrupt origins. More importantly, it held detailed maps of the Morrison property showing locations where other evidence might be buried, including the old mine shaft that the dying deputy had. Mentioned in his letter, the Morrison family thinks they can silence you the same way. They've silenced other threats over the years, Sarah continued. What they don't understand is that this isn't just about one old man who stumbled onto their secret. This is about 3 generations of evidence gathering, 3 generations of witnesses, 3 generations of people who've been waiting for justice. Below them, the tactical team had finished their search of the cabin and was beginning to expand their sweep pattern into the surrounding forest. Morrison Jr. was growing impatient, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air as he berated his men for their failure to locate their target. "They'll find us eventually," Jed said quietly. "These mountains are big, but they've got the numbers and the equipment to run us down." Sarah smiled, and for a moment Jed could see Thomas's mischievous grin reflected in her features. "Actually, Uncle Jed, I don't think they will. You see, while they were busy threatening you and planning this little expedition, I was busy contacting some friends of mine in federal law enforcement. The FBI should be arriving any minute now, along with representatives from the Montana Attorney General's office and a few other agencies that take a dim view of murder conspiracies that cross state lines." As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of helicopters began to echo through the mountains. Morrison's tactical team looked up nervously as the sound grew louder, their professional confidence beginning to crack as they realized their mission had just become considerably more complicated. "How did you—" Jed began. "Thomas Crowley Miller wasn't just a lumber camp worker in Oregon," Sarah said with pride. "He was also a federal deputy marshal, appointed specifically to investigate corruption in territorial law enforcement. Everything he gathered about Sheriff Banks and his associates was collected under federal authority. The case never closed, Uncle Jed. It just went dormant until someone could provide the physical evidence needed to make arrests." The helicopters were clearly visible now, black shapes against the afternoon sky, bearing the distinctive markings of federal law enforcement. Below in the clearing, Morrison Jr. was frantically trying to coordinate a retreat while his father stood frozen beside their vehicle, perhaps finally understanding that 50 years of successful deception were about to come to an end. Buck pressed against Jed's side, his tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. The old dog had brought his human to this moment through patience and persistence, leading him step by step toward a justice that had seemed impossible just days before. "Come on, Uncle Jed," Sarah said, standing and shouldering her pack. "It's time to go home and watch some very bad people get exactly what they deserve." The helicopters descended into the clearing like mechanical birds of prey, their rotor wash sending clouds of dust and pine needles swirling through the air. FBI agents in tactical gear rappelled from the aircraft with practiced precision, their movements coordinated and purposeful in a way that made Morrison's hired mercenaries look like amateur hour. From his vantage point on the hillside, Jed watched as federal agents quickly surrounded the Morrison vehicles. The tactical team that had seemed so threatening moments before now found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by professionals who'd been planning this operation for weeks. "William Morrison Jr., a voice boomed through a helicopter-mounted loudspeaker. "This is FBI Special Agent Martinez. You and your associates are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and step away from the vehicles with your hands visible." Morrison Jr.'s face had gone pale, but he wasn't ready to surrender without a fight. Jed could see him gesturing frantically to his men, trying to coordinate some kind of defensive action or escape plan. The hired guns looked uncertain. They'd been paid to intimidate an old hermit, not to engage in a firefight with federal law enforcement. But it was Morrison Sr. who drew Jed's attention most powerfully. The elderly man, who had once been Sheriff William Banks, stood beside the lead vehicle, leaning heavily on a walking cane, but refusing to show weakness, even in the face of inevitable capture. At 89, he retained the bearing of a man who'd spent decades commanding others through force of will and fear of consequences. Sarah appeared beside Jed, her face grim with satisfaction. "Look at him," she said quietly, watching the old man through her binoculars. 50 years of thinking he'd gotten away with murder, and he still can't believe it's finally over. The standoff stretched for several tense minutes. Morrison Jr. was clearly weighing his options, calculating whether his family's wealth and influence could somehow extract them from this situation. But the federal agents were patient, professional, and overwhelming in their numbers and firepower. It was one of Morrison's tactical team members who broke first, a younger man, probably in his 30s, who'd realized that fighting federal agents was a career-ending proposition regardless of how much he was being paid. He laid down his rifle and walked toward the FBI perimeter with his hands raised. "Smart man," Sarah murmured. The others should follow his example, but Morrison Jr. had other plans. As his remaining men began to waver, he pulled his grandfather toward one of the SUVs, apparently hoping to use the old man as leverage or to make a desperate escape attempt. It was exactly the kind of mistake that Jed had seen younger men make in combat. Panic leading to poor decisions that turned difficult situations into disasters. "This is your final warning." Agent Martinez's voice echoed across the clearing. "Release the elderly man and surrender immediately, or we will use whatever force is necessary to resolve this situation." Morrison Jr.'s response was to duck behind the SUV, dragging his grandfather with him. The old man stumbled and nearly fell, his age making him more liability than asset in any escape attempt. But something in Morrison Sr.'s expression caught Jed's attention, not fear or confusion, but a cold calculation that reminded him uncomfortably of battlefield commanders he'd known who were willing to sacrifice anyone to achieve their objectives. "He's planning something," Jed said quietly to Sarah. "Your great-grandfather didn't survive 50 years as a criminal by panicking under pressure. He's got another card to play." As if responding to Jed's warning, Morrison Sr. reached inside his jacket and withdrew something that made the federal agents tense up immediately. A small device that looked like a radio transmitter, its antenna catching the afternoon sunlight. "I have explosives placed around this mountain," the old man's voice carried clearly across the clearing, stronger and more authoritative than his frail appearance suggested. "Remote detonators that I can activate from this device. Stand down, your men, and let us leave, or I'll bring this entire hillside down on all of us." The claim sent a chill through Jed's bones. During his research at Pete's trading post, he'd learned that Morrison Holdings owned numerous mining claims in the area, claims that would have given them legitimate reasons to purchase and transport explosives over the years. An old criminal with nearly unlimited resources and decades to plan for this possibility might very well have prepared such a contingency. Sarah's face had gone ashen. "He's not bluffing," she whispered. "The family stories always said he was paranoid about being discovered. Grandfather wrote about finding evidence that Banks had prepared multiple escape plans, including some that involved destroying evidence, even if it meant collateral damage." Below in the clearing, Agent Martinez was conferring urgently with his team leaders. The presence of potential explosives changed the tactical situation completely. A misstep now could result in casualties among federal agents and civilians alike, but it was Buck who provided the most telling intelligence about Morrison Sr.'s claim. The old dog had been sitting quietly beside Jed throughout the standoff, but now he was showing signs of agitation that suggested he detected scents or sounds that confirmed the presence of explosives nearby. "He's really done it," Jed said grimly. "The crazy old bastard has turned my mountain into a potential war zone." The realization that his peaceful sanctuary might be destroyed in the final confrontation with his brother's killers filled Jed with a rage he hadn't felt since Vietnam. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about protecting the place where he'd found peace after years of war. The place where Thomas's memory had finally led him toward truth and resolution. Morrison Sr. stood straighter now, feeding off the fear and uncertainty his threat had created. For a moment, he looked less like a frail old man and more like the corrupt lawman who'd terrorized Montana territory 50 years before. Age had bent his body, but it hadn't broken his will to survive at any cost. "Time to make a choice, Agent Martinez," Morrison called out. "Justice for some long-dead outlaws, or the lives of everyone on this mountain. Which matters more to the federal government?" The standoff stretched into its second hour as federal agents worked frantically to locate and disarm the explosives Morrison Sr. claimed to have planted. Bomb disposal experts had been helicoptered in from Missoula, their equipment scattered across the mountainside as they followed Buck's nose toward the scents of chemical compounds that the old dog had been detecting all afternoon. Jed found himself in the surreal position of serving as a consultant to the FBI, his intimate knowledge of the mountain's terrain proving invaluable in narrowing down potential hiding spots for explosives. Sarah worked alongside him, her grandfather's maps and notes providing additional clues about locations where the Morrison family might have cached dangerous materials over the decades. There, Buck whined and pawed at a seemingly innocent pile of deadfall near Jed's water source. When the bomb disposal team investigated, they found 20 pounds of commercial mining explosives, rigged with a radio detonator enough to contaminate the spring that fed Jed's cabin and several downstream communities. But it was Morrison Sr. himself who provided the key to resolving the crisis. The old man's arthritis made it difficult for him to hold the detonator device steady, and his grandson's increasingly frantic attempts to coordinate an escape were clearly wearing on his patience. Age and stress were taking their toll on a man who'd relied on intimidation and calculation for nearly 9 decades. "Listen to me, you federal jackasses," Morrison Sr. called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I've got enough explosives on this mountain to level half the valley, but I'm willing to make a deal." Agent Martinez approached cautiously, his weapon lowered but ready. "What kind of deal, Mr. Banks?" The use of his real name made the old man's eyes flash with something that might have been pride or fury. "You know who I am, then?" "Good. That saves time on explanations." He shifted his weight against his cane, the detonator device trembling in his other hand. "Here's my offer. Let my grandson go free, and I'll tell you where all the explosives are hidden. Arrest me if you want. I'm too old to spend much time in prison anyway." But the boy had nothing to do with the old business. It was a lie, and everyone present knew it. Morrison Jr. had been actively involved in covering up his family's crimes for years, using his wealth and influence to suppress investigation and eliminate potential witnesses. But the old man's paternal instinct to protect his heir was overriding his tactical judgment. "No deals," Martinez replied firmly. "Both of you are going to surrender, and we're going to find those explosives with or without your help." Morrison Sr.'s face twisted with rage. "Then you'll find them the hard way." His finger moved toward the detonator trigger, but age and emotion made him clumsy. The device slipped from his arthritic grasp, tumbling toward the ground in what seemed like slow motion. It was Buck who saved them all. The old dog launched himself from Jed's side with speed that belied his age, covering 30 yards in seconds to intercept the falling detonator. His jaws closed around the device just before it hit the rocky ground, his gentle retriever training allowing him to catch it without triggering the mechanism. "Good boy, Buck." Jed's shout of pride and relief echoed across the clearing as federal agents swarmed Morrison Sr. and his grandson. The old criminal went down without further resistance, the fight finally going out of him as he realized that even his final desperate gambit had failed. Morrison Jr. tried to run, but his urban conditioning was no match for agents trained in wilderness pursuit. They brought him down 50 yards from the vehicles, his expensive suit torn and his face blooded from contact with mountain granite. As the dust settled and handcuffs clicked into place, Agent Martinez approached Jed and Sarah with an expression of professional respect. "Mr. Crowley, Ms. Miller, the Bureau owes you both a debt of gratitude. This case has been on our books for 50 years, and without your investigation, it might have remained unsolved indefinitely." Sarah knelt beside Buck, who was still holding the detonator device gently in his mouth. "Easy, boy," she said softly. "You can let go now. It's over." The old dog released the device into her hands, then padded back to Jed's side with his tail wagging. He'd completed his mission, not just finding the wet dollar bills that started this journey, but seeing it through to its conclusion. The faithful companion who'd guided his human toward justice had literally saved the day with the same gentle mouth that had once carried wounded. Birds back to their nest, Morrison Sr. was helped into a federal transport vehicle, his age requiring medical supervision even under arrest. As the door closed behind him, he looked back at Jed with eyes that held no remorse, only the bitter acceptance of a man who'd finally run out of tricks and time. 50 years, he called out through the vehicle's window. 50 years I kept that secret buried. Your brother should have stayed dead like he was supposed to. But Jed was no longer listening to the old criminal's bravado. His attention was focused on the compass Sarah wore around her neck, Thomas's compass, finally pointing toward home after decades of leading the family through wilderness toward this moment of justice. The explosives were located and disarmed over the following hours, revealing the extent of Morrison Sr.'s paranoid preparations. But the real victory wasn't in preventing disaster. It was in the quiet satisfaction of promises kept and debts finally paid. Thomas Crowley could rest in peace at last. 6 months later, Jed stood at the edge of Copper Creek Ravine, watching the morning mist rise from the valley floor like the ghosts of old secrets finally set free. The stagecoach wreck had been carefully excavated by federal archaeologists, Thomas's remains and those of his fellow passengers given proper burial in the Hamilton Cemetery with full honors. The headstone that had marked an empty grave for 50 years now covered the bones of the brother Jed had mourned and lost and found again. Buck padded up beside him, moving more slowly these days, but still faithful in his companionship. The old dog had become something of a local celebrity since the Morrison arrests, his role in solving Montana's oldest cold case earning him a commendation from the governor, and more belly rubs than any hound could reasonably expect. But fame hadn't changed Buck's essential nature. He remained devoted to his human and content with the simple rhythms of mountain life. The memorial stone Jed had carved from local granite stood at the exact spot where the stagecoach had lain hidden for nearly 5 decades. The inscription was simple but complete. In memory of Thomas David Crowley, James Miller, Sarah Chen, and William Foster, passengers of the Copper Creek stage, murdered May 15, 1873. Truth delayed is not truth denied. Below the names, Jed had added a line from Thomas's letter. Justice finds a way, even through the longest darkness. The legal proceedings had unfolded with the methodical thoroughness that characterized federal investigations. Morrison Sr., revealed to the world as the corrupt Sheriff William Banks, had been declared competent to stand trial despite his age. The evidence gathered by 3 generations of the Crowley family, combined with the physical proof found at the wreck site, had built an unassailable case for conspiracy, murder, and decades of subsequent cover-up activities. Morrison Jr.'s trial had concluded just last week with convictions on multiple charges ranging from conspiracy to obstruction of justice to attempted murder of a federal witness. His business empire, built on the foundation of blood money, was being systematically dismantled by court order. Properties purchased with stolen funds were being seized, timber rights revoked, mining claims cancelled. The Morrison family fortune, accumulated over 3 generations of successful criminality, was evaporating like morning dew, but the legal victories, satisfying as they were, it paled in comparison to the personal revelations that had emerged from Sarah's investigation. Thomas's family in Oregon had been located and contacted, revealing a network of descendants who'd preserved their grandfather's memory and continued his work even without knowing the full truth about his past. Sarah had become a regular visitor to the mountain, bringing with her stories and photographs that filled in the missing decades of Thomas's life. She'd shown Jed pictures of Thomas in his later years, still recognizable despite the lines and grey hair, still carrying himself with the Crowley stubborn pride that had sustained him through exile and danger. There were images of Thomas's wife, Margaret, a schoolteacher whose intelligence and strength had clearly attracted the man who'd been forced to reinvent himself in a strange land. Pictures of their children, including Jed's namesake nephew, growing up with stories of a mysterious Uncle Jed who lived free in the Montana mountains. Most precious of all were the letters Thomas had written but never sent, messages addressed to Jed and their parents, sharing the small triumphs and sorrows of his Oregon life. Reading those letters had been like receiving delayed Christmas presents, each one a reminder that love and family connection could survive separation and secrecy and even death itself. The healing hadn't been without its complications. News reporters had descended on the mountain for weeks after the arrests, eager to sensationalize the story of the hermit who'd solved Montana's oldest cold case with the help of a money-retrieving dog. Jed had granted exactly one interview to a young reporter from the Hamilton Herald who'd reminded him of Thomas at that age, earnest, curious and respectful of the gravity that surrounded certain stories. "Why now?" the reporter had asked. "What made you decide to follow Buck's trail after all these years?" Jed had thought about that question for a long time before answering. "I suppose because Buck knew something I'd forgotten," he'd finally said. "He knew that some things are worth following, even when you don't know where they'll lead. Dogs understand loyalty in ways that humans sometimes don't. They don't give up on the people they love, not even when those people are long dead." The interview had been published with a photograph of Jed and Buck standing beside Thomas's memorial stone. The image had been reprinted in newspapers across the country, bringing letters from other families who'd lost members to unsolved crimes. Other people who understood the weight of unanswered questions and the relief that came with finally learning the truth. Pete McAllister had become something of a celebrity in his own right, his trading post now featuring a small museum display about the Copper Creek robbery and its eventual solution. Visitors came from across the state to see the place where the investigation had begun, to hear Pete's stories about the mountain hermit and his remarkable dog who'd refused to let the past stay buried. As autumn settled over the Bitterroot Range, painting the aspen leaves in shades of gold that reminded Jed of Sarah's hair and Thomas's young laugh, he found himself settling into a new rhythm of life. The cabin remained his sanctuary, but it was no longer a hiding place. Visitors were welcome now, Sarah and her family, descendants of Thomas, who came to see where their grandfather's story had begun and ended. Researchers and historians who wanted to document the full scope of the Morrison family's crimes. The mountains themselves seemed different somehow, as if the revelation of old secrets had lifted a weight that Jed hadn't even realized they'd been carrying. The forest felt more alive, the streams ran clearer, and the wildlife had returned to patterns that local hunters said hadn't been seen in decades. Whether these changes were real or simply the result of Jed's altered perspective, he couldn't say. But Buck seemed to sense the difference too, his morning explorations taking on the relaxed confidence of a dog whose most important work was complete. Standing beside Thomas's memorial as the sun climbed over the eastern peaks, Jed felt the deep satisfaction that came from promises kept and duties fulfilled. His brother's murder had been avenged, his family's honor restored, and his legacy preserved for future generations who would carry the Crowley name with pride rather than sorrow. Buck nudged against his leg, a gentle reminder that breakfast waited back at the cabin and that the day's simple pleasures were calling. Jed scratched behind the old dog's ears and smiled at the endless optimism that had led them both through darkness toward light. "Come on, boy," he said quietly. "Let's go home."